Good afternoon. Talking about art and resistance in a small city. I want to talk about Peterborough, the place we all live and work in, and what makes its cultural scene so different and possibly unique. Now, this is part, and I'm basing what I talk about on here, on an ongoing research project of myself and my colleague, Alan O'Connor, who's over there, the director of the PhD program in cultural studies. And we've been working on this project for 3 years now, conducting over 100 interviews and holding public meetings, focusing especially on a small, independent, self-funded performance space called the Union that flourished here from 1989 to 97. I came to Peterborough and to Trent more than 40 years ago. But before that, for 10 years, I'd been working in the huge, bustling, cosmopolitan city of Hong Kong. Complete contrast. Instant culture shock, therefore, when I got here. That first winter when I was here, I remember taking friends from Europe and East Asia, from Hong Kong, China, Japan, around my new city. And I remember their puzzlement. What does he think he's doing in a place like this, they were thinking. I could see it going, through their eyes. And I would take them to the center of the city, which is what it called itself, though not what any of them would have called it. It was a mean, nondescript little town to them. And I would take them to where Peterborough Square now is. Peterborough Square didn't exist in those days. There was a big, ugly, empty parking lot with brick walls waiting for demolition and grubby banks of snow. We would stand in the middle of it, and with a grand gesture, I used to say, you must think of this as the Piazza San Marco of Peterborough. Though Peterborough had become a city of considerable prosperity in the late 19th century, a flourishing factory town and commercial center for the surrounding agricultural area, with a high culture of imported concerts and operettas and local amateur theatricals. By the 1970s, a gradual economic decline had begun to set in. Peterborough was on the way down. It felt like a town that had seen better days. In the 1970s. With empty shop fronts and quite a lot of poverty behind the polite, just about polite, exteriors. But that economic decline coincided with the growth of a remarkably varied arts scene. And very soon, I found myself fascinated by the cultural energy that was at work here. Beneath the surface, rather like spring flowers at this time of the year outside that astound us by pushing their heads out from dirty snowbanks. In the 1970s, well before the Union that we're working on in this project, but well before that was established, the artist-run Parallel Gallery art space had provided a Peterborough venue not only for visual arts, but for performance and for music. A lot of experimental music, a lot of really large-scale public art was being done there. It had been started by a collective of artists, people like David Burke and Dennis Turbin, who had been drawn to Peterborough from other parts of the USA and of Canada, from California and St. Catharines, and other artists from other places. And they'd been drawn here, I think, for a variety of different reasons. Low rents was one of the reasons for artists coming to Peterborough at that time. And also, what is not so evident now, kind of back to the land idealism. I call it a kind of rural anarchy that was not very progressive in some of its attitudes and really quite patriarchal in many of them. But that back to the land idealism was very much a part of the cultural scene of Peterborough in those, for me, early days. Alternative lifestyles flourished here and were perhaps more tolerated here than they were in other small towns and, for that matter, in other large cities in Ontario. The federal government helped in all of this, which is a ridiculous thing to say nowadays. The federal government had money to spend on the arts in those days, not just on institutions for the arts, but a whole new network of artist-run centers that was being funded right across the country. Quite remarkable in its generosity and imaginativeness. Different times, indeed, from the ones that we're in now. Now, at the same time, Trent University was having an increasing impact on the local cultural scene, particularly in the areas of writing, theater, and music, as well as the theorization of culture. In the early days, there was a lot of really fantastic music going on at Trent, and much of that transferred itself into the bar scene in Peterborough in the 1970s. Really important artists who are part of the whole complex fabric of music history in this country. Peter Robinson College, with its newly founded Cultural Studies program, and with the help of substantial grants from the Canada Council and the Bronfman Foundation, was able to draw big-name international artists and theorists such as Alain Robbe-Grillet, Michael Fried, Michael Snow, into a dialogue with local people, local practitioners, with undergraduate students. Again, very unusual. And the Canadian Images Film Festival became the primary forum for presentation and discussion of Canadian films in the whole country. The decade immediately preceding the establishment of the Union, this little theatre space that I'm coming onto, was a time simultaneously of institutional consolidation and of an increasingly politicized, contestatory mood. In the summer of 1980, Peter Robinson College hosted the first national conference of what called itself the Cultural Workers Alliance, which brought together progressive artists and activists from across the country. In 1982, Trent, Artspace, and Canadian Images were charged with showing a film called A Message from Our Sponsors by Vancouver filmmaker Al Razudis, that the Ontario Censor Board had refused to license. That there was a tiny moment of relatively explicit sex, you know, the sort of thing that HBO wouldn't think of anymore nowadays in their programs. And the publicity from the resulting very high-profile court case was one of the major factors in bringing about the elimination of the Ontario Censor Board by the Peterson government, it was. It also led to a show about censorship, and so one event cross-fertilizes another in a community like this in a way in which it doesn't necessarily do in larger spaces where things get isolated from each other and have their own discrete existences rather than independent, interdependent interactions with each other. This court case led to a show about censorship called Arts Against Repression, which assembled censored work from, people like Margaret Lawrence, Mark Prant, Michel Brault, all kinds of literary, film, visual artists who had had their works censored by government organizations and by local busybodies at various times in their careers. And that show was put on by Artspace at the Market Hall, the most prominent building in downtown Peterborough. And it went all around the province to various little galleries in various kinds of expressions of itself. Artspace had become, by that point, this very large, very lively organization, hosting everything from ice sculpture contests to major new dance initiatives. And it had become the largest and most active of these artist-run centers in the country. Interesting that this should happen in Peterborough. However, its higher public profile brought it into increasing confrontation with the city authorities and with its landlords, Marathon Realty, which was the property arm of Canadian Pacific. And Marathon Realty tried to close Artspace down in 1988. Only a series of street demonstrations by local artists and the subsequent intervention by the MPP, Peter Adams, enabled it to stay open. That's what I mean by the development of a certain kind of contestatory ethos around the arts in the community. They weren't just providing what people wanted them to provide. They were establishing a critical role with regard to the culture that they were a part of. In the last few years of the 1980s, theatre became the most vital arts practice in the region and within ArtSpace itself. A collective known as Rehearsal in Progress, RIP, wrote and produced a series of overtly politicized labor-centered plays that focused on union activism. That's the Pioneer Chainsaw Massacre that you referred to, Julia. It was based on extensive community research, much like the work that Rob has gone on doing in Millbrook and Fourth Line and the whole area around here. And Rob was one of the 8 people who were part of the collective that wrote Pioneer Chainsaw Massacre. It was based on community research into the attempts of workers at the Pioneer Chainsaw plant to take over and run the company as an industrial co-op along the lines established in Mondragon in Spain, anarchist lines of worker control of the means of production. There was another play, Postscript, about strikes at Canada Post, which was performed not only at the Market Hall, but at the National Conference of the Postal Workers' Union. Rob Winslow, at that same time, had begun a series of improvised soap operas that were performed late at night at ArtSpace, the Market Hall. Very quickly, they became hugely popular. And I remember driving down George Street, and the people were spilling out onto the sidewalk and out onto the street in a lineup at 11 p.m. to get into a theatre performance. Peterborough. By 1988, however, ArtSpace was struggling against a crushing deficit, and the performance artists who had been increasingly active there began to look for a more sustainable and self-sustaining model for expression and survival. An initial small group who had been active both in Rehearsal in Progress and the soaps found a new downtown location on Hunter Street in a medium-sized storefront that had once been part of a coffin factory. And Rob organized a soap which was about the coffin factory, which was an even more gruesome history than any reality would have been. From the start, the union made its facilities freely, that's the key word, freely available to anyone who wished to participate in it. For the next eight years, it provided space not only for a wide range of original avant-garde and community-based plays, but for an alternative music scene and a twice-weekly soup kitchen. More than 30 people were involved in the planning and also in the construction work in the new space, getting it opened. There was no director, no board at all. They chose quite deliberately to operate on a non-profit and volunteer basis, outside of the established corporate structural guidelines of the major government granting agencies. Anyone who came to meetings and put in 2 hours of work a week was a member, and the space could be booked in return for 50% of the door, however small or large that amount might be. There were some performances that had 4 people, I think was the one that I went to, was the lowest. It was a great production. And I've been at terrible productions that had over 100 people at them, and also some very good ones that were very popular. Over the period from 1989 to 97, a large number of original works were written and performed, to such an extent indeed that Jan McIntyre, the theatre officer for the Ontario Arts Council, suggested to me that there seemed to be more new theatre happening in Peterborough than in Toronto. Though the themes of the plays were very wide-ranging in topic and style, it was an essentially local theatre that emerged. As the publisher put it in the introduction to a series of Peterborough plays, because government grants tend to go to the large cities, these plays are poor theatre, not the theatre of extravagance, so they fit well into the town where they are made. I was going to go on and talk about a play that we did there that Rob and I were both involved in, and which was written collectively, called Frankenstein Meets the Recession. And that play actually came out of the soup kitchens that we ran there. It started from a local sort of above-ground theatre, Arbor Theatre, as it was at those days, a kind of summer stock theatre, deciding to put on Frankenstein. And somebody at one of the soup kitchens growled, "Yeah, well, what happens when Frankenstein meets the recession?" I can't do that kind of voice as well as Rob can. And what indeed, that was what the play was about. And it was written by a group of 9 people, collectively, 4 of whom had worked in theatre before and 5 of whom had not. Although the main emphasis in the Union was on theatre, local promoters of punk, metal, and industrial music soon persuaded the collective to open the space to underground music, and increasingly that became an essential part of what went on there. Through the 1990s, the space became a link in the touring circuit for underground hardcore punk bands. On one extraordinary evening, I didn't even know about this at the time, Anti-Schism, Rorschach, and Born Against, the leading anarcho-punk bands in the USA at that time, played for 20 or 30 enthusiastic Peterborough kids there. At more regular shows, local punk, metal, and industrial bands from Peterborough and nearby towns and villages played to packed rooms of friends, musicians, and high school kids. It's amazing in retrospect now to see from the interviews that we've been doing just how influential such a space could be on the lives and values of the people who went to and who worked there. They ran it themselves. There was no hierarchical structure, no adult supervision, no policing. It's 15 years now since the Union closed its doors, but it's become a part of Peterborough's underground mythology, a model of what can happen when a group of talented individuals come together to share their creative work.